What if I told you that the shape of your nose could predict your character? Your face could reveal whether you're honest or dishonest. For centuries, respected scientists and philosophers believed this. This is physiognomy, the pseudoscientific belief that facial features and head shape reveal personality traits, character, and intelligence. Today, we look at physiognomy not as a truth, but as a case study in how bad science gets legitimized, popularized, and weaponized. We'll ask, is physiognomy an effective way of gathering data? The answer is no. It's pseudoscience born from an early attempt to systemize psychology, but ultimately used to justify discrimination and harm. We'll explore the key figures who developed it, trace how it became popular, and understand why it's scientifically invalid, and examine the real-world harms it caused. Physiognomy dates back to approximately 4th century BC in ancient Greece. Around 4th century BC, early Greek philosophers began linking facial features to character. This was usually based on facial features' similarity to animals. In the classical period, Aristotle and others began writing about physiognomy philosophically. In the Renaissance, Giambattista della Porta, hard name to say, attempts an empirical study on physiognomy. In the 18th century, John Caspar Lavater systematizes and popularizes the practice for the colonial project. In the 19th and 20th centuries, it becomes intertwined with scientific racism and phrenology, specifically in criminology. In the 20th century onward, it begins to get discredited and is rejected as a pseudoscience. What we see here is a pattern. Physiognomy began as a philosophical speculation, evolved into an attempted science, got weaponized by those seeking to justify the colonial project, and was eventually recognized for what it is, a pseudoscience. Let's look into 3 key figures who shaped this history. We'll start with one of the most influential philosophers of all time, Aristotle. So, who was Aristotle? Well, Aristotle lived from approximately 384 BC to 322 BC. He was the Greek philosopher and founded his own school, and was incredibly influential across many disciplines. Aristotle was interested in understanding physiognomy because he was so deeply interested in understanding nature and human character. He believed all things had underlying essences that could be observed. Aristotle's views on physiognomy were varied. He believed that physical features could indicate character. He wrote about physiognomy in various works, specifically Prior Analytics 2.27, as referenced in our paper. He used examples like people with small foreheads are shrewd, or those with broad faces are courageous. He built on earlier Greek thinkers, but gave physiognomy philosophical legitimacy. So basically, if the founder of one of the most major schools of thought is talking about this thing, it must have some value. Aristotle's enormous influence meant that when he wrote about physiognomy, it wasn't dismissed as random speculation. It gained the weight of serious philosophy. This is important because it shows how authority and reputation can lend credibility to ideas, even ideas without any real scientific basis. What we know now is that Aristotle was wrong. His physiognomic observations were based on anecdote and assumptions, not empirical evidence. There was no real evidence that broad faces indicated courage or that small foreheads indicated that someone was shrewd. It was assumptions made based on people's likenesses to animals or just what people thought at the time. There was no real testing, no real experiment. Over 1,500 years later, another figure would try and turn Aristotle's philosophical ideas into actual science, Giambattista della Porta.
We will start with section 4, Giambattista della Porta and the Renaissance. First of all, who was della Porta? He was a human who lived from 1535 to 1615. He was an Italian polymath who lived during the Renaissance period. He was a writer, dramatist, and a scientist as well. Why was he interested? So, I have. Living during the Renaissance, Della Porta was fascinated by natural philosophy and trying to understand the secrets of nature. He wanted to systemize knowledge. His contributions, he attempted to make physiognomy more empirical and systematic. He wrote Physiognomia in 1586, which was one of the first comprehensive treatments of the subject. He made detailed observations of facial features, claimed patterns emerged. He used comparative anatomy, which is comparing human faces to animal faces, which he believed had certain character traits. And examples are a person with a lion-like face would be brave, whereas a person with a fox-like face would be cunning. His methods involved observation, categorization, and attempted pattern finding. And now, why it mattered. Della Porta moved physiognomy from pure philosophy towards what looked like science, observation, categorization, examples. But here's the problem: observation without rigorous methodology, without control groups, without accounting of bias, it's science. It's still just speculations with examples. What we know now, Della Porta's experiments were anecdotal. The animal human comparisons were imaginative but unfounded. The transition is 2 centuries later, a Swiss pastor would take Della Porta's work and turn it into a massively popular movement. That person was none other than Johann Caspar Lavater. Now, section 5: Johann Caspar Lavater and popularization. Who was Lavater? He was a human as well, who lived from 1741 to 1801. He was a Swiss clergyman, writer, and mystic with significant influence in the 18th century in Europe. Why was he interested? Lavater saw physiognomy as a way to understand human nature and morality. He had religious and philosophical interests in human characters. His contributions: he wrote Physiognomische Fragmente, which were essays on physiognomy. He wrote it during the period of 1775 to 1778. An enormous influential work. Popularized physiognomy to a mass audience through accessible writing. He created detailed illustrations and classifications of facial types, claimed to have found definitive connections between facial features and moral characters, believed physiognomy could be used for moral and spiritual understanding. His work was translated across Europe. He became celebrity-like in intellectual circles. Why it mattered. Lavater didn't invent physiognomy, but he pitched it. He made it popular. He gave it a kind of scientific appearance while disguising it in moral and spiritual language. His widespread influence meant physiognomy went from being something philosophers discussed to something that felt like established science to the majority of people. Here is the problem. Lavater lacked rigorous methodology, control of bias, or statistical analysis. He saw patterns he expected to see. And the transition is, so far we have philosophers and natural philosophers proposing these ideas, but something crucial happened in the 19th century. Physiognomy became weaponized. It got connected to scientific racism and colonialism. That's where the real danger began.
Now I want to talk about what makes something a real science and why physiognomy is absolutely not one. A real science has a few important traits. First, it makes testable and falsifiable predictions, meaning you can use them to actually prove things right or wrong. It uses careful, systematic methods that try to reduce bias. Other researchers should be able to repeat the results and get the same findings. Real science also goes through peer review, where experts question and challenge the ideas. And most importantly, science is willing to change when the evidence doesn't support the theory. A pseudoscience is actually the opposite. It makes claims that you can't really disprove. It relies on stories and examples instead of real data. It avoids proper testing, avoids peer review, and never updates its ideas even when evidence clearly shows they're wrong. And it uses scientific sounding language to look legitimate even though it has no real scientific foundation. Physiognomy checks every box of a pseudoscience. First, its claims were unfalsifiable. If a broad-faced person was brave, that proved the theory. If a broad-faced person was timid, they created an excuse. It was designed so it could never fail. Second, it was full of confirmation bias. Practitioners saw the patterns that they expected to see. If they went looking for cruel faces, they thought they found them not because cruelty lives in the face, but because humans naturally search for patterns even when they aren't real. Third, physiognomy had no rigorous method, no control groups, no statistical tests, no cultural comparisons, no long-term studies, just opinions, guesses, and subject observations. Fourth, it is directly contradicted by actual scientific evidence. Psychology research shows that facial features do not predict personality. People with the same facial type have completely different personalities. Different cultures disagree on what a kind or dangerous face looks like. And identical twins who have the same face still grow up with personality differences. Fifth, it confuses correlation and causation. Even if people thought current faces looked honest or cruel, that doesn't mean the face caused those traits. It only shows that humans have biases about appearances. Here's an example. If I claimed people wearing red shirts are smarter than people wearing blue shirts, and I only wrote down the times it looked true while ignoring all the times that it didn't, that would be pseudoscience. And that is basically how physiognomy worked. In real psychology, personality is shaped by genetics, environment, and life experience, not by facial structure. Any tiny patterns we think we see come from stereotypes, not truth. Now here's where this becomes not just scientifically wrong, but morally dangerous, because physiognomy didn't stay in the philosopher's library. It got adapted, modified, and weaponized for some of the worst purposes imaginable.
So now I'm going to talk about how physiognomy causes real harm. In end of the 18th century, physiognomy mixed with the phrenology and early anthropology. People in Europe wanted a scientific way to prove that some races were better than others. So they created fake system saying that face shapes and head shapes showed that who was smart, superior, better, or naturally criminal. So it wasn't a real science, but it was used to like it is a kind of real science. How it causes harm? There are three different ways how they created harm to the people, and the first one is slavery and colonialism. People said that these measurements show these groups are naturally meant to serve, but this was used to excuse slavery and taking over other countries. And next one is criminal profiling. Physiognomy creates races, criminal types, and police and courts use these ideas to target and punish people according to their color. And the last one is eugenics. These ideas fed into eugenics, which means forced sterilization and controlling who could have children. So hi everyone, we are up to our conclusion. The first question up here is physiognomy an effective way of gathering data? The answer is absolutely no. How? The physiognomy has ancient root but formalized by figures like Aristotle, Della Porta, and Lavater. Despite its pretense to science, it lacks in replicability, methodology, and falsibility that actual science requires. It is a pseudoscience, unfalsible, prone to confirmation bias, contradicted by evidence. When weaponized for scientific racism and colonization, it caused real harm. The first up here is broader lesson. This project teaches us something important. Ideas that sound scientific but could be pseudoscience. It's important to think critically about the methodology, evidences, and potential biases behind any claim. The final thought up here is physiognomy is a case study in how smart people can believe wrong things and how pseudoscience can cause real harm. Understanding that helps us better is critical thinking. That's all for our topic. Thank you for the program.
Now to turn things around, I'm just gonna list some of the physical traits that cued into what they thought meant personality traits, and it could be a fun little game for you to listen to your traits and see what kind of personality traits they would depict you as from these traits. Monogamy, they truly believe that they could read a whole person's personality by just looking at someone's face. So imagine this like a little tour through an old pseudoscience funhouse mirror. First up, the forehead. A high, broad forehead was supposed to mean intelligence, nobility, and creativity, while a low, narrow forehead meant you were stubborn or not very bright. So basically, your entire brain power was judged before you even opened your mouth. Next, the eyes. Large, open eyes were seen as honest and innocent, like the person could never lie. Small, deep-set eyes supposedly signaled secrecy or suspicion. Even eye color got dragged into this. Light eyes were labeled cold or detached, and dark eyes were called warm and emotional. It was like personality astrology, but for your eyeballs. Then we slide over to the eyebrows. Arched eyebrows were refined and gentle, especially for women. Heavy, straight brows were linked to strength and seriousness, and the unibrow, that was treated like a red flag, supposedly showing intensity or even untrustworthiness, as if one extra line of hair revealed your entire soul. And of course, they had opinions about noses. A straight Roman nose meant leadership and confidence. A small button nose meant friendliness. A large or hook nose was to show ambition or aggressiveness. They basically turned noses into a personality quiz no one asked to take. Now let's talk about lips. Full lips were said to be warm and loving, then thin lips were labeled serious or cold. A wide mouth meant you were bold and expressive. Imagine someone deciding your emotional capacity based on your lip width. Next up, the chin. A strong, square chin supposedly meant determination and willpower. A weak chin meant you were timid. A pointed chin meant you were mischief. And one look at your jawline, and boom, your destiny was assigned. Skin texture was another big one. Smooth, clear skin was linked to virtue and youth, while rough skin was unfairly labeled as a moral disorder. Yes, in physiognomy, even your pores were judged. Head shape blended into physiognomy later on. A roundness head supposedly meant kindness. An angled head meant you were cold, logically. The shape of your skull determined whether you were a sweetheart or a supervillain. And yes, even ears were judged. Large ears meant curiosity and good listening. Small ears meant you were sensitive. Ears that stuck out were seen as naive. Apparently, your ears were snitching on your personality the whole time. Hair also got its turn. Thick, curly hair meant passion and impulse. Straight, smooth hair meant calm discipline. Baldness could mean wisdom or weakness, depending on the century. Imagine the confusion. Body shape was part of the story, too. Tall, upright posture meant strength and virtue, or short, stooped posture meant shyness or lack of status. Broad shoulders meant courage, and finally a smile. A broad smile meant kindness and honesty. A tight little smile meant you were calculating or secretive. All of this was treated as scientific truth. Now here's the fun part. When you hear these descriptions, you can instantly visualize people you know who fit them and people who don't. This is exactly why physiognomy felt believable at its time. But the reality is these traits tell us absolutely nothing about a person's character. They only reveal the stereotypes people projected onto each other, and that's why this whole system wasn't wrong. It was just dangerously convincing at the